All right, so in order to understand monopolistic competition in the short run, what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare its market structure. Here's monopolistic competition. This is a cost structure. All you're seeing on here are the costs, and we call that the cost structure. We have a marginal cost curve, an average variable cost curve, and an average total cost curve. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a couple, we're going to look at a main difference between monopolistic competition and perfect competition. So I'm going to compare the cost structure of monopolistic competition with perfect competition. So up here in perfect competition, you see a marginal cost curve, average total or average variable cost curve, and an average total cost. For all intents and purposes, there's really no difference in the cost structure between monopolistic competition and perfect competition. They are, for the most part, they're facing the same rent for locations. They're facing the same materials costs, the same labor costs, all of that same kind of stuff, okay? The difference between monopolistic competition and perfect competition is going to come in the demand curve and what differences are caused because of the difference in the demand curve. Remember, we learned before that perfect competition has the demand curve for perfect competition is horizontal, right? It's a horizontal line. But for a monopolistic competition, because it's a little bit of a monopoly, it's going to have a downward sloping demand curve, and we're going to see how that changes the price that is determined and also the quantity produced that is determined. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to break the video and I'm going to go ahead and draw in demand curves and also marginal revenue curves. All right. So I've gone ahead and put in a demand curve for perfect competition. Now remember, in perfect competition, the demand curve is horizontal, it's flat. And because of that, it's also equal to the marginal revenue curve. So to review, in perfect competition, the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve are the same curve, which means that in perfect competition, we only have 4 curves, right? We've got the marginal cost curve, the average variable cost curve, the average total cost curve, and then the curve that is both the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve, okay? Down here, however, in monopolistic competition, you'll see something kind of familiar. In monopolistic competition, we go back to 5 curves just like Monopoly, right? Because as soon as that demand curve begins downward sloping, it has a different marginal revenue curve. The marginal revenue curve is now a different curve than the demand curve. So here we have our marginal cost curve, we have our average variable cost curve, our average total cost curve, then we have our downward sloping demand curve and our downward sloping marginal revenue curve that is a different curve. Now one key difference I want to point out here is that the downward sloping demand curve in monopolistic competition is not as steep as in Monopoly. In Monopoly, our demand curve started maybe up here and went steeper down here, and our marginal revenue curve was also much steeper. That is a main difference between monopolistic competition and Monopoly. Monopolistic competition, even though it has a downward sloping demand curve, it is not as steep as the downward sloping demand curve of Monopoly, okay? And so here's the main thing I want you to learn from this comparison I'm about to give you. I want you to focus on understanding how the quantity produced is different in monopolistic competition versus perfect competition, and the difference in price in monopolistic competition versus perfect competition. And I want to remind you that both of these companies have the exact same cost structure. And the only things that are going to be different are their demand curve, which will cause a difference in quantity produced, the profit maximizing quantity, and a difference in the profit maximizing price that is charged. So let's review perfect competition. I'm going to use a green marker here. And so because both perfect competition and monopolistic competition, they're both trying to maximize their profit. So they're going to produce where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Okay, so we still want both of them still want to produce where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, because that's going to be their profit maximizing quantity. We learned that rule a long time ago, right? So here's marginal revenue and here's marginal cost. They are equal where they intersect. And so here's where they intersect right here. And so we're going to go from there. We're going to go vertically downward from there. Down here, vertically, as vertical as we can do without a level. So this is going to be our profit maximizing quantity. Do you see that? Now I do want to point out, I don't know if you noticed this just a minute ago, but I put a dashed line, a black dashed line on the monopolistic competition graph. Okay, that is this same demand curve. What I want to do is I want to compare what's happening in perfect competition to what's happening in monopolistic competition. So you can see that that intersection is happening right here, which is the exact same place. Okay, don't focus on this solid black one. We're looking at where marginal cost, the blue line, intersects the dashed line right here. Do you see that? And it's in the exact same place as on the graph above it. Why? Because it's the same demand curve and it's the same marginal cost curve. So profit maximizing quantity for perfect competition. And now we're going to look at what the profit maximizing quantity is for the monopolistic competitor. So the monopolistic competitor is going to choose a quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Well, the marginal revenue curve is this red curve here, and it intersects the marginal cost curve right here. They intersect here, and therefore that is going to be, for the monopolistic competitor, that's going to be the profit maximizing quantity. So we're going to put QPM, profit maximizing quantity, for the monopolistic comp, for the monopolistic competitor. So you tell me, this red quantity right here, is that smaller than or larger than the green quantity? Well, it's to the left, and therefore it is a smaller quantity. So what we can conclude is this, something you need to write down about monopolistic competition, is that in monopolistic competition, is that they tend to produce a smaller quantity to maximize PM, profit maximizing. They produce a smaller quantity than perfect competition does. So they're going to actually produce less of their stuff. Why? Because it's going to make them profit more. Now let's look at their the price that they're going to charge. Now, up here in monopolistic competition, they are price takers, and therefore the price is determined in the overall market. It was given to them. That is their price. Where the quantity hits the demand curve and we go over, it's horizontal, that's the price. But let's look at the price that is determined in monopolistic competition. Remember, after we determine the profit maximizing quantity, we're going to take that quantity up to the demand curve, which is right here, and we're going to go over to the vertical axis. Now, this black dashed line right here, that is our perfect competition price, right? That's the price in perfect competition. But this red one right here, that is our price in monopolistic competition. And what can you see here? Tell me about the price in monopolistic competition. That is a higher price than the price in perfect competition. And so in monopolistic competition, they will produce a smaller quantity, but they will charge a higher price. And that's what I need you to understand from this example, is that as we compare monopolistic competition to perfect competition, if we took two businesses that had the exact same cost structure, and the only difference between the two businesses is that one of them is facing a perfectly competitive market, and the other one is facing a monopolistic competition market. Why? Because they were able to differentiate their product. By differentiating their product, they are able to earn monopoly profits. They become price setters. just like a monopoly, with a downward sloping demand curve, and they can then charge a higher price and produce a smaller quantity that is the profit maximizing quantity. Okay? And what we're now going to do is we're going to look at the 4 different circumstances that a monopolistic competition firm can face in the short run. All right, so I know that the lines are a little messy, but I think you'll get the basic idea. Okay, in each one of these we have 5 curves. Okay, all 5 of them have a downward sloping demand curve. Note that it's not very steep, downward sloping demand curve. All of them have a downward sloping and separate marginal revenue curve in red. Marginal revenue curve is in red. Okay, note that all the marginal revenue curves are steeper than the demand curve and downward sloping, also separate from the demand curve. All 4 of these graphs have an upward sloping blue marginal cost curve, right? And all of them have an orange average variable cost curve, right? And a purple average total cost curve, right? But in all 4 of these situations, the cost structure is slightly different, putting each one of these monopolistic competitors in a different situation. Remember, there are 4 main situations, and what we're going to do here is we're going to identify those 4 situations for these monopolistic competitors. Remember that the first thing we do when we want to analyze a market graph is we identify the profit maximizing quantity, which is determined where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Okay? And so we're going to go ahead and get a red marker here for the quantity. And in this one, we can see that the marginal cost and marginal revenue intersect right here. And therefore, this is our profit maximizing quantity, quantity PM. Then what we do is, after we identify the profit maximizing quantity, we take that quantity and we go up to the demand curve to determine the price. There's the demand curve. And now we're going to go sideways over here to determine the price. So that's the price that's going to be charged. And remember that we can multiply the price, the height, which is the price, and the width times quantity. Price times quantity. This rectangle represents total revenue. Okay? Now we're going to identify the average variable cost and the average total cost. If we follow the vertical quantity line up to the average variable cost right here, we can go over with a little dashed line. That gives us our average variable cost. And then we take our average total cost at the purple line, which is right here. Average total cost. In this situation, you can see that price is larger than average total cost. And average total cost, of course, is larger than average variable cost because it always is. But in this circumstance, because price is higher than average total cost and average variable cost, this rectangle right here, average total cost times quantity, that's the total cost of the for the business. And the total revenue is a larger rectangle. That means that this rectangle right up here represents the profit rectangle, profit, that this monopolistic competitor is earning. And therefore, this graph that we're looking at is a situation where this monopolistic competitor is earning a profit and earning an economic profit in the short run. Okay? All right, let's go over to this one here. We're going to go to where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. We're going to bring that down. That's going to give us our profit maximizing quantity. We're going to take that line up to the demand curve, and we're going to go over, to the demand curve right there. We're going to go over, that is the price that's being charged. We're going to identify our average variable cost. If we take this line up to the AVC curve and go over, that is our average variable cost, AVC. If we take the purple, go to the average total cost curve, we can see that the average total cost, look what's happening there. The average total cost is equal to, average total cost is equal to price. So price is equal to average total cost. And that means that this rectangle right here, quantity times price, this rectangle is total revenue and quantity times average total cost. It's the exact same rectangle. So total cost is equal to total revenue. Why? Because price is equal to average total cost, and therefore this graph is a situation of zero economic profit or break even. So this is the break even situation, okay? And remember, with the break even situation, we know it's break even. It's where the average total cost curve is tangent to the demand curve. Do you see that point right there? The average total cost curve is just barely touching the demand curve right at the profit maximizing quantity. Okay, so that is a clear indicator of the break-even situation. All right, let's come down to this bottom left one here. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost right here. We're going to bring that down here. That'll be our profit maximizing quantity. We're going to bring that quantity up to the demand curve and over. Oops, I didn't quite go vertical there. It's more like right here, I guess. Vertical to there. Okay, let's come over here, and that is our price. And then if we go to this vertical quantity line up to the average variable cost curve, we can see that average variable cost is less than price. That's good. We're recovering. So, we're recovering our average variable cost. But if we take this quantity curve all the way up to the average total cost curve, you can see that the average total cost curve is higher. ATC is larger than price. So now we have the situation where average total cost is greater than price, but price is greater than average variable cost. And so price times quantity, this rectangle right here is our total revenue, but quantity times average total cost, this is our total cost. So total cost is larger than total revenue, and so this rectangle right in here is loss. This company is experiencing a loss, right? So they should shut down, right? Because they're experiencing a loss? No. Remember, this rectangle here where price is higher than average variable cost, this is the variable cost of the company. Average variable cost times quantity gives us the total variable cost, the variable cost. And our revenue is larger than the variable cost. So we're recovering some of our fixed costs. This region between average variable cost and average total cost, that's the fixed cost. This rectangle is fixed cost, and this rectangle is recovered fixed costs. So remember, we are recover FC. We are recovering some of our fixed costs. If we shut down, we're going to have to pay out all of the fixed costs. But because we're recovering some of our fixed costs, we only have to lose this much of our money. That's our only loss. We are limiting our loss by staying in business. So we're going to continue operating at a loss. So we're going to say this is operating at a loss. At a loss. Last one over here. Again, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, that's going to determine our profit maximizing quantity. Quantity PM, profit maximizing quantity, that's an M. We're going to go all the way up to our demand curve and come over, and that's going to give us our price. Okay, so this rectangle is our total revenue rectangle. Okay, but now we're going to follow that quantity up to the average total or average variable cost curve there. That's supposed to be a vertical line. In your notes, make sure that's vertical. It's hard to see from this angle. If I was in front of the board, it would be much easier to see, but this cramped space is making it harder. All right, so that's our average variable cost, AVC, which you can clearly see is higher than the price. So variable cost, this rectangle, is larger than the total revenue. So our total revenue isn't even covering our variable costs. But even worse, if we take this all the way up to the average total cost curve, you can see that the average total cost is way up here, ATC. So average total cost is larger than average variable cost, like it's supposed to be, but that both of those are larger than the price. And so now our total cost is way larger than our total revenue, and our variable cost is larger than our total revenue, and therefore This huge loss right here, okay, our loss, this rectangle right in here, that represents our fixed costs, okay? So here's our fixed costs, but our loss is represented by this larger rectangle. Our loss from operating is larger than our fixed costs. And therefore, if we continue to do business, we will lose more money than if we shut down and only pay our fixed costs. And therefore, that means that this circumstance, because average total cost is greater than average variable cost and average variable cost is greater than price, in this circumstance, this monopolistic competitor should shut down. And what I want to show you is this, is that just like the perfect competitor, just like the monopoly, the monopolistic competitor is also facing potentially the four same situations in the short run. And remember, in the short run, profits can be sustained and losses can be tolerated. And so what we're now going to do is we're going to look at the efficiency of a monopolistic competition market, and then we're going to talk about monopolistic competition in the long run.